Hello, boys and girls. We are back for our second reading lesson. This is Module 0, and we are on Lesson 2. So in this lesson, students focus on the order of events in Thank You, Mr. Falker, examining Trisha's journey from loving books to becoming a struggling reader and back again. This process supports our organize stage, in which you will identify basic elements of a text and summarize its key events and ideas. We will be working with our vocabulary journal today, our response journal, and our knowledge journal to record your vocabulary, your observations, and your growing body of knowledge. So in this lesson, you're going to set up your first entry into your vocabulary. And then by the time we are done, you will also have completed a story map. So in this lesson, this is our essential question, and it is, how does reading help us build knowledge? In this lesson, remember, we have our essential question, our focusing question, and our content framing question. The essential question you will answer by Friday, because we will have finished what this module is about, and it's about reading, helping us build our knowledge. So you'll be able to answer that by Friday. You'll also be able to answer by Friday the question about the book that we are looking at. And we are looking at Thank You, Mr. Falker. So by Friday, you'll be able to answer, what does reading mean to Trisha in Thank You, Mr. Falker? For today's lesson, we will be talking about what is happening. So by the end of today, you'll be able to organize your thoughts to find out what is happening, and you'll be able to use this craft question. Let me see if I can move that. You'll be able to use this craft question to help you answer the content framing questions. And that is, why is it important to write about what I read? So right now, you may either print out your prior knowledge worksheet from Seesaw, or you may go to your Seesaw account and you may work on your prior knowledge assignment. So in this lesson, you need to think back to the story, Thank You, Mr. Falker, that you listened to yesterday. And you're going to answer, what was your favorite part of the story? And you're going to answer that by telling me why that was your favorite part. So what you will need to do is you will pause the video and you will go to your Seesaw account and you will write in complete sentences, what was your favorite part of the story and why? You must have 3 complete sentences to answer. And I'm going to tell you how you should set this up. So if the question is, what was your favorite part of the story? You should start by answering, my favorite part of the story was, and tell me when that was. And then you can give me your answer as to why that was your favorite part of the story. That was my favorite part of the story because, and then tell me why. And then your last sentence should sum up your writing. So you could say, that is why so-and-so was my favorite part of the story. So those would be 3 complete sentences. So you may go ahead and pause the video, go complete your prior knowledge, and when you are finished, you may come back and press play. Go. All right, so now we're going to finish moving on. So today's lesson will focus on the events in the book and on Trisha's journey. So just a minute ago, you answered what was your favorite part of the book and why. So make sure that you answer those in complete sentences. And when you're done, if you would like to, make sure to share that with a partner that you have at your house, a brother, sister, cousin, a parent, a grandparent, whoever you're there with. Share that reading with them that you just wrote, and then make sure to go back and edit your response to make sure that you have it in complete sentences and you've answered the question thoroughly. So now, yesterday, you just you looked at what you noticed and what you wondered about Thank You, Mr. Falker. So first, we're going to talk about some important words. So we're going to get to now the vocabulary part. So we learn new words in order to help us grow more of what we're reading. And then these new words can make your writing more interesting if you use the word in your writing, and you can have more ways to say what you want because you're learning newer words. All right, so this brings us to the vocabulary section. And this is another assignment that is in Seesaw, and I'm going to walk you through this, okay? Because yesterday you read Thank You, Mr. Falker, and so now we're going to talk about this word torture. Okay, so when we learn new words, they will be recorded on this vocabulary worksheet. Okay, and we're going to talk about the word, what it means, what part of speech it is. So the word, I'm going to go ahead and show you, it's right here. So the word that we're going to talk about is the word torture. It is a noun. Torture is a person, place, animal, or thing. Okay, and then it is when you are in a lot of pain with your emotions. And so some other words that might mean the same of torture is pain or misery. Okay, so now we're going to listen to that part of the story where she talks about how she was in torture, and then you're going to answer, why was reading torture for Trisha? And then, do you think drawing was torture for Trisha? So now we are going to, I'm going to end the show and we're going to go listen to that part of the story, and then we'll come back to it. This is where she talks about torture.
Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads. It wasn't happening to hers.
All right, I'm going to play it one more time.
Graphs 2. School seemed harder and harder now.
Listen for that word torture.
Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads. It wasn't happening to hers.
All right, so we're going to come back to our torture page, and it says, why was reading torture for Trisha? So the text said, reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. So again, remember, torture means a lot of pain with your emotions. Other synonyms, other words that mean the same as torture would be pain or misery. So I'm going to put those in place of the word torture. Reading was just plain pain. Reading was just plain misery. Reading was just a lot of pain with your emotions. So why was reading torture? There's that word, torture, for Trisha. You're going to pause the video and you're going to go answer that question. Why was reading torture for Trisha? You can restate this question to start your sentence. So it might sound like reading was torture for Trisha because, and answer why it was torture for her. And then the next question is, do you think drawing was torture for Trisha? You should answer with, yes, I think drawing was torture for Trisha, or no, I do not think drawing was torture for Trisha, and then explain why. Okay, so pause the video, go answer in Seesaw or upload the worksheet to Seesaw where you have answered the 2 questions. When you have finished and you're ready to begin, you'll press play. Go. All right, so now that we have done our prior knowledge of yesterday with our notice and wonder, and now that we have learned what torture means, now we are going to learn about a new routine called a story map that helps you organize important information from a story. Okay. All right, so remember, torture means a lot of pain with your emotions. So you may have said it was hard for her. She felt dumb reading. She wasn't able to read very well. Others would make fun of her when she would try to read, or she wasn't getting better at reading even though she was trying. Those we're not going to do. All right, so here is that story map. You should remember doing something like this in 2nd grade. So what information is important to know in a story like Thank You, Mr. Falker? And those are right here. The important things are called our story elements, and that's the characters, the setting, what conflict or problem was in the story, what events took place to solve the problem, and then how was the story resolved? How did the story end? This is what you're going to answer today. And I'm going to help walk you through this as well. So the first thing that we're now going to do is we're going to re-listen to the story. Okay, we're going to read aloud again. Thank you, Mr. Falker. And we're going to pause occasionally to add notes to this worksheet. All right, so remember, the characters are the people in the story. The setting is where and when the story takes place. The conflict is the main problem that characters are facing. The events are the main things that happen in the story. And the resolution is how the conflict is solved. All right, here we go. We're going to re-listen to the story.
Welcome to A Teacher Reads a Book. Thank You, Mr. Falker, by Patricia Polacco. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you. Then he handed the book to her. Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. What is that taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, Sweet. Then all the family said in a single voice, Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was hers at last. Soon she was going to learn to read. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books from school, and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all she hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in the 1st grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. Still, she loved being in school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with the crayons. In 1st grade, you'll learn to read, her brother said. In first grade, Trisha sat in a circle with other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out letters and words. They said,
I'm going to stop right here for just a second, and you should be able to tell me almost every character in the story. So if we were to write on your story map who the characters are, you should say Trisha is a character. Her family is a character, unless you want to name like Grandpa. And then right now, the students in her class are also characters. And the setting, you should have found right now that the setting, Trisha and her family, those characters, let's see here. Oh, so the characters, the setting so far is at school. Okay. The characters are in school. All right, let's continue reading.
Said, be, be, oi, boy, and la, ook, look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Trisha looked at a page, all she saw were wiggling shapes. And when she tried to sound out words, the other kids laughed at her. Trisha, what are you looking at in that book? They'd say. I'm reading, she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up in the second reader and third reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Trisha began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or, when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind her farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Trisha said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandma answered. To be different is the miracle of life. You see all those little fireflies? Everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart? Trisha didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side, where the light comes from. One evening they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass, or you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be. They laughed and both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were, on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now.
So again, we're going to talk about the characters. So the characters are Trisha, her family, her grandma and her grandpa and her mom, the students in her class, and so far, her teacher. We haven't met Mr. Fokker yet, but we know that Mr. Fokker will also be a character in the story. The setting is at her home and at her school. And the problem, you should know the problem by now, and the problem is that Trisha is not able to read. These are all things that you can pause the video and go write down in your story map. So, what has happened first in the story to solve her problem? The first thing that she's done so far is that Trisha acts like she knows how to read. Trisha draws for her reading. Okay, so those are all things that you could have written down so far. Let's continue reading.
Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. Then, one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But in the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called out to her on the playground. How come you are so dumb? Other kids stood near him and laughed. Trisha could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Trisha wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she'd say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then, when Trisha started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. And the usual teacher's pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trisha whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?"
So now we know our last character, and that is Mr. Falker. So remember, Trisha tries to act like she knows how to read. This is one of the events in your timeline. And then her and her family move to a new school in California because her mom got a new job. But Trisha still can't read at her new school. And now the students at her new school just make fun of her.
When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings. They still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then, one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy, and the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you could look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He had sat behind Trisha for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Trisha didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned in her face, and called her Toad. Trisha was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Faulkner was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground, or in the cafeteria, or even in the bathroom, and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her into her secret hiding place. Have you become a mole? He laughed, and he pulled her out into the hall and danced around her. Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell. Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Fokker. He marched Eric down into the office. When he came back, he found Tricia. I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again, he said softly. What was he teasing you about, little one? I don't know, Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure Mr. Fokker believed she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Fokker to help her with a sentence. Then she'd say the same thing he did. Good, he would say. Then one day Mr. Fokker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, let's play a game. I'll shout out letters. You write them on the board with the wet sponge as quickly as you can. A, he shouted. She wiped a watery A. 8, he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14. 3. D. M. Q, he shouted out. He shouted out so many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run away. But Mr. Fokker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. You poor baby, he said. You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid. She sobbed. But, little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers. He smiled at her. That took cunning and smartness and such bravery. Then he stood up and finished washing the board. We're going to change that. All that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that.
So now you should be able to conclude all of the events that have led up to her resolution. So first, Trisha tries to act like she knows how to read. Next, Trisha moves to a new school in California. Then Trisha still can't read, and students at her new school make fun of her. After that, her teacher, Mr. Falker, spends extra time teaching her how to read. I can't wait to see what the resolution is and how the story ends.
Now almost every day after school she met with Mr. Fokker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first she made circles in sand, and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. Another day they flicked letters on a screen, and Tricia shouted them out loud. Still, other days she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out, and that felt good. But though she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Fokker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of a page and pointed at it, almost as if it were magic, or as if light poured into her brain. The words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off too slowly. She read a sentence, then another and another, and finally she read a paragraph. She understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Fokker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Then she went into the living room and found the book on the shelf. The very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." And she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were happy. So very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Fokker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first, he had difficulty placing me, and I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Fokker," I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Fokker. Thank you."
All right, so that is the end of the story, and you should now be able to answer the how the story is concluded. What was the resolution? And that was Trisha learns how to read. So if you were not able to fill out the story map as the story went along, you may pause the video now, because right now I am walking you through how to do the story maps. Eventually you will have to do these on your own. So again, the characters, and I see that there was an error on this, but the characters were Trisha, her family, the students in her class, her teacher, her first teacher, and then Mr. Fokker. There's an error. This should say setting. The setting was at her home and at school. The conflict of the story, the main problem, was that Trisha is not able to read. And then here are the events that you should be writing down. And then the story ends with it being resolved that Trisha learns how to read. So you may pause the video, write down the things to your story map, either on a piece of paper on your worksheet and upload it, or you may submit them directly onto Seesaw. Press play on the video when you are ready to begin. Go. Okay, so now you should know that using the story map helps you understand the story better. It helps you sum up what the story was about. It helps you to keep track of the character and the events that are going on. It helps you to put the events in order, and it helps you to identify the conflict and the way that the conflict was solved. All right, our last thing to do for this lesson is answer the content framing question. And our content framing question was, why is it important to write about what I read? Okay, that was your content framing question. So now this will be collected for an exit ticket and graded. This one, answering the content framing question, will be collected and graded. So you're going to use the blanks to fill in the sentence below to write a summary sentence about the story. So it's already started for you. Trisha wanted, what did Trisha want? Trisha wanted blank. But what was the problem? She wanted to be able to do something, but she couldn't. So what did she do? Okay, so this goes back to the story map as well. Let me go back here. Your story map will help you to answer that. What could Trisha, what did she want to be able to do that she couldn't? It was the conflict. What did she want to be able to do? And then what did she do, or what happened to solve that? Okay. All right, so you should now be able to answer. Trisha wanted blank, but blank, so blank. We'll rewrite that sentence with the information that's missing on the lines in a complete sentence. Make sure you start with Trisha with a capital T, you fill in the missing blanks, and you have a period at the end. You may pause the video to write, and then when you are done writing, you may press play on the video to continue. All right, so throughout the year, we will have a craft question, and this question is to help guide us. So why is it important to write what I read? So Trisha believes reading is torture because it is very hard for her to do. And thank you, Mr. Falker. The text says, when Trisha looked at the page, all she saw were wiggly shapes. The text also says that Trisha felt dumb and different. This evidence shows that Trisha wasn't very good at reading, so it became torture for her to do it. What you should have noticed is that the author uses words from the story. He explains the meaning of the word torture, and that he mentions the book name. Okay, we're going to move on. So make sure that you go complete your exit ticket. Think about what Trisha wanted mostly in the story, what held her back from what she wanted most, and think about then what she did to solve it. So what did she want most in the story? What held her back? And then what did she do to solve her problem? There are 3 things you will need to write in the sentence frame. Using the sentence frames, fill in the blanks to show that you know what is going on in the story. You will do this on Seesaw or on the Seesaw page and upload it. Again, this will be an exit ticket and it will be graded. All right, boys and girls, that is all for today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you have a great day. See you tomorrow.